Since ancient times, people have retained their sexual essence for the purposes of health, regeneration, mental and spiritual development. This practice is still alive today and is known as semen retention. The Ancient Archives SR manuscript, 54 chapters on the practice of semen retention. 2 years of work and research condensed into one book. If you wish to physically own the works of the Ancient Archives, then this book is for you. Welcome. We now move on to the third tier of the iceberg, historical figures. The pages of history contain much of the practice of semen retention, powerful figures and people of influence that contributed much to the history books. Physicians, army generals, spiritual leaders, philosophers, writers, inventors, artists, and so on, all discussing the concepts of semen retention and sexual energy conservation, and detailing the benefits of the practice and consequences of excessive sexual engagement. This video is for entertainment purposes only. If you are considering whether or not to start semen retention, keep in mind that this chart follows mainly the positive and neutral aspects, and it is recommended you look at all the research available before deciding to commence. Let's begin. Tier 3. Historical figures. Nicola Tesla. The world-famous engineer and inventor Nicola Tesla, who invented AC electricity and the Tesla coil, once said, "I recognize the importance that sex plays in the life of man. Nature has made its attraction irresistible to ensure the perpetuity of the race. As for myself, I have found that the thinker is confronted with the problem of perpetuating either the species or mind. Before I produced the rotating magnetic field, I concentrated all my powers upon my experiment. The strain would have killed 100 oxen. I certainly could not have survived it if I had permitted my energies to be diverted into the channels of sex." Nikola Tesla, born in the 1850s, lived until age 86, an age above even today's life expectancy, but significantly longer than the standard lifespan of his time. He never married and was said to live a celibate life. He once famously stated, "Be alone. That is the secret of invention. Be alone. That is when ideas are born." Hippocrates. Hippocrates is commonly regarded as the father of Western medicine. He was born around the time of 460 BC. His body of work that has survived is known as the Hippocratic Corporal and contains roughly 60 texts. It is written in one of these texts on the topic of semen retention. Law governs everything. The man's semen comes from all the fluid that is in the body, being the separation of what is most potent. Here is an illustration in proof that it is a separation of the most potent part. The discharge of such a small quantity in intercourse makes us weak. This is the way of it. Veins and cords lead from every part of the body into the penis. When these are somewhat affected by friction and are heated and filled, a kind of tickling sensation sets in, and consequently pleasure and warmth pervade the whole body. As the penis is rubbed and the whole person is agitated, the fluid in the body is heated, diffused, and churned by the movement and becomes foamy, as all other fluids too become foamy by churning. So too in man the most potent and fattest part is separated from the fluid as it foams and passes into the spinal cord, for there are passages that lead into it from every part of the body, and there is a circulation of matter from the brain to the loins, to every part of the body, and to the spinal cord, and there are passages leading from the cord such as to permit a flow and ebb of fluid into it and out. Hippocrates believed semen emissions caused tabes dorsalis, that is, a neural degenerative condition. Galen. Galen was a physician and philosopher from ancient Greece. Born in 129 AD, he was one of the most prominent and well-known physicians of ancient times and contributed greatly towards the field of Western medical science. On the topic of semen, he said, "It is not at all surprising that those who are less moderate sexually turn out to be weaker, since the whole body loses the purest part of both substances, and there is besides an accession of pleasure, which by itself is enough to dissolve the vital tone, so that before now some persons have died from excess of pleasure. The loss of the seed is at the same time attended with a loss of vital spirit, so that it is no wonder that over-frequent coition should enervate the constitution, since it deprives the body of its purest essence." Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher, mathematician, and founder of the Pythagorean school. He contributed greatly to the fields of mathematics and metaphysics. The impact he had on the world, especially towards mathematics and philosophy, cannot be overstated, and his ideas and concepts are still very much alive and well today. Pythagorean students were to take a vow of celibacy in the summer months. Pythagoras taught students to be very cautious of pleasure and indulgence, including, though not limited to, the sexual act. Pythagoras thought sexual relations to be solely for the purposes of procreation, as anything beyond that was not deemed to be in accordance with nature. Asked once when a man should consort, that is, have sex with a woman, he replied, "When you want to lose what strength you have." Plato. Plato was a renowned ancient Greek philosopher, regarded as one of the top minds of ancient times. It was said he was directly influenced by Socrates and significantly influenced by the Pythagorean teachings. He viewed sexual engagement as the lowest animal form and the relinquishment of such desire as necessary for virtuous living. He also believed that semen was derived from the spinal marrow. Abbott writes on Plato, "He saw the soul as morally superior to the body, which impeded it in its execution of higher goals. Sexual intercourse was the lowest form of all, plunging humans into bestiality. What was required to surmount these lower forms of love was virtuous living, defined by austerities compatible with Pythagoreanism, in particular sexual continence." Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who contributed greatly to the field on the subjects of ethics, politics, biology, psychology, and so on. He was a student of Plato, who in turn was a student of Socrates, and is well regarded as one of the most notable philosophers in ancient history. Aristotle wrote extensively on the subject of semen and its nutritive qualities. He writes, "For the exhaustion consequent on the loss of even a very little of the semen is conspicuous because the body is deprived of the ultimate gain drawn from the nutriment. In most men and as a general rule, the result of intercourse is exhaustion and weakness rather than relief." Semen and Focal wrote, "For Aristotle, semen is the residue derived from nourishment, that is of blood, that has been highly concocted to the optimum temperature and substance. This can only be emitted by the male, as only the male, by nature of his very being, has the requisite heat to concoct blood into semen. According to Aristotle, there is a direct connection between food and semen. Sperms are the excretion of our food, or to put it more clearly, as the most perfect component of our food. Furthermore, Aristotle claimed that it was the area around the eyes that stored the best semen, and from this perhaps we can make the common connection among retainers that the retention of semen is good for the eyes, and the excessive expulsion of semen can negatively impact the eye's appearance. Aristotle also wrote on man's desire for sex and the importance of moral thought. He once famously wrote that wickedness is nourished by lust. In a book on the works of Aristotle, it was written, "A man becometh bald through venery," that is, sexual relations, because that is letting forth of natural humidity and heat. And so, by that excess in carnal pleasure, moisture is consumed, which is the nutriment of the hair, and therefore baldness doth ensue. And this is evidently proved in eunuchs and women who do not grow bald, because they do not depart from their moistness. Aratus. Aratus was a physician born in the 2nd century BC. He is one of the most celebrated ancient Greek physicians of history. It was said that after Hippocrates, no single Greek author has equaled Aratus. In his writings on the topic of semen, he said, "If any man is in possession of semen, he is fierce, courageous, and physically mighty, like beasts. Evidence for this is to be found in athletes who practice abstinence. For it is the semen, when possessed of vitality, which makes us to be men, hot, well-braced in limbs, hairy, well-voiced, spirited, and strong to think and act, as the characteristics of men prove. For when the semen is not possessed of its vitality, persons become shriveled, have a sharp tone of voice, lose their hair and their beard, and become effeminate, as the characteristics of eunuchs prove." Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is perhaps the most well-known military general of ancient times. Born in 100 BC, he defeated Pompey to become dictator of Rome. On the topic of sexual restraint, Julius Caesar said, "The Germans differ much from these usages. Those who have remained chaste for the longest time receive the greatest commendation among their people. They think that by this the growth is promoted. By this the physical powers are increased, and the sinews are strengthened. And to have had knowledge of a woman before the 20th year they reckon among the most disgraceful acts." Gandhi. Gandhi is well recognized as one of the 20th century's greatest political and spiritual leaders. He became a leading figure in India's fight to gain independence from colonialism. Gandhi wrote extensively on his upbringing of sexual indulgence and his struggles with lustfulness. Gandhi was said to have been very affected by his father's death and held deep regret that he had engaged in lustful activity rather than be at his father's bedside when he was stricken with illness and passed away. At 38, he took a vow of celibacy. Gandhi wrote on the topic, "The sexual glands are all the time secreting the semen. This secretion should be utilized for enhancing one's mental, physical, and spiritual energy. He who would learn to utilize it thus will find that he requires very little food to keep his body in a fit condition, and yet he will be as capable as any of undertaking physical labor. Mental exertion will not tire him easily, nor will he show the ordinary signs of old age. Just as a ripe fruit or an old leaf falls off naturally, so will such a brahmachari, when his time comes to pass away, with all his faculties intact. Although with the passage of time the effects of the natural wear and tear must be manifest in his body, his intellect, instead of showing signs of decay, should show progressive clarity. If all this is correct, the real key to health lies in the conservancy of vital semen energy. A firm grasp of the fact that semen is meant to be used only for procreation and not for self-indulgence leaves no room whatsoever for indulging in animal passion. Assimilation of the knowledge that the vital fluid is never meant for waste should restrain men and women from becoming crazy over sexual intercourse. Isaac Newton. The world-famous mathematician, physicist, astronomer, and alchemist Isaac Newton practiced sexual restraint throughout his life. It is said that he never married and died a virgin. Considered a solitary genius, Newton worked for 18 hours a day. He wrote on the topic of sexual restraint, "I consider my greatest accomplishment to be lifelong celibacy." His approach to fighting lust was to keep his mind occupied. On the topic, he wrote, "The way to chastity is not to struggle with incontinent thoughts, but to avert the thoughts by some employment, or by reading, or by meditating on other things." Arthur Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher, perhaps most well known for his work, The World as Will and Representation, wrote on the topic of sex, "At every age, excessive use of that power shortens life, whereas moderation enhances all the powers, especially muscular strength. For this reason, abstemiousness and moderation were part of the training of Greek athletes. Directly after copulation, the devil's laughter is heard. This is said to be in reference to the melancholy experienced by man during the refractory period after orgasm. It is said to illustrate the moment of clarity experienced by man when he realizes that he was merely acting out of desire and that the results were ultimately meaningless." Swami Sivananda. Swami Sivananda was a yoga teacher, spiritual leader, and proponent of Vedanta. He helped spread the spiritual teachings of yoga and Vedanta to the world. On the topic of brahmacharya, that is, Indian celibacy, he wrote, "Celibacy is to a yogi what electricity is to an electric bulb. Without celibacy, no spiritual progress is possible. It is a potent weapon and shield to wage war against the internal evil forces of lust, anger, and greed. It serves as a gateway for the bliss beyond and opens the door of liberation. It contributes perennial joy and uninterrupted bliss. It is the only key to open the Sushumna, the chief among astral tubes in the human body running inside the spinal column, and awaken the Kundalini, the primordial cosmic energy located in the individual. Semen is a mysterious secretion that is able to create a living body. Semen itself is a living substance. It is life itself. Therefore, when it leaves man, it takes a portion of his own life. A living thing cannot be put to laboratory tests without first killing it. The scientist has no apparatus to test it. God has provided the only test to prove its precious nature via the womb. The very fact that semen is able to create life is proof enough that it is life itself. I have thousands of letters from young men who have wasted this precious fluid and are in a miserable plight. Several young men even go to the point of committing suicide. Through reckless waste of semen, they lose all their physical, mental, and intellectual faculties. Those who are perfect brahmacharyans have lustrous eyes, a healthy body and mind, and a keen, piercing intellect. Saint Augustine of Hippo, considered the greatest Christian philosopher of antiquity, his influence was said to be profound and helped shape modern Christian thought. He wrote, "Lust not only takes possession of the whole body and outward members, but also makes itself felt within, and moves the whole man with a passion in which mental emotion is mingled with bodily appetite, so that the pleasure which results is the greatest of all bodily pleasures. So possessing indeed is this pleasure, that at the moment of time in which it is consummated, all mental activity is suspended." Samuel Auguste Tisot. Tisot was regarded as one of the great physicians of the 18th century. He was appointed Vatican medical advisor and had received praise from Napoleon Bonaparte himself. His most famous work was a treatise published in 1760 on masturbation, and was said to be one of the best-selling medical books of the 18th century. On the topic of masturbation, he wrote, "The first ill consequences of them to such as are guilty of self-pollution are a considerable diminution of strength, a less or greater paleness, sometimes a slight but continual jaundice, often pimples, which come and disappear only to make room for fresh ones, and are constantly reproducing themselves all over the face, but especially in the forehead, the temples, and around the nose, a notable leanness, an astonishing sensibility to the changes of weather, especially to cold, a languor in the eyes, a weakening of the sight, a great impairment of the faculties, especially of the memory." Tisot cites various examples of his and his associates' patients and their physical and mental symptoms and illnesses caused by excessive masturbation. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, a physician, inventor, and the father of Kellogg's cornflakes, was strongly against the practice of masturbation. He was also a very vocal advocate for sexual abstinence and wrote of the dangers of sexual excess. It is said that his invention of cornflakes was made as an attempt to lower people's libido. He wrote, "If illicit commerce of the sexes is a heinous sin, self-pollution, or masturbation, is a crime doubly abominable. It is the most dangerous of all sexual abuses, because the most extensively practiced. The vice consists in any excitement of the genital organs produced otherwise than in the natural way. Its frequent repetition fastens it upon the victim with a fascination almost irresistible. It may be begun in earliest infancy and may continue through life. Even though no warning may have been given, the transgressor seems to know instinctively that he is committing a great wrong, for he carefully hides his practice from observation. In solitude he pollutes himself, and with his own hand blights all his prospects for both this world and the next. Even after being solemnly warned, he will often continue this worse than beastly practice, deliberately forfeiting his right to health and happiness for a moment's mad sensuality." Mark Twain. Mark Twain was a celebrated American author who penned the classics The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In 1879 in Paris, at a writers' convention, he spoke the following words on the topic of masturbation. "The results of the habit are loss of memory, loss of virility, loss of cheerfulness, and loss of progeny. Of all the various kinds of sexual intercourse, this has the least to recommend it. As an amusement, it is too fleeting. As an occupation, it is too wearing. As a public exhibition, there is no money in it. It is unsuited to the drawing room, and in the most cultured society it has long been banished from the social board. It has at last, in our day of progress and improvement, been degraded to brotherhood with flatulence. Among the best bred, these two arts are now indulged in only private, though by consent of the whole company, when only males are present. It is still permissible in good society to remove the embargo on the fundamental sigh. My illustrious predecessor has taught you that all forms of the social evil are bad. I would teach you that some of these forms are more to be avoided than others. So in concluding I say, if you must gamble your lives sexually, don't play a lone hand too much. When you feel a revolutionary uprising in your system, get your Vendome column down some other way. Don't jerk it down." Redrick Nisha. Nietzsche was a German philosopher who wrote extensively in the late 1800s on the topic of philosophy, morality, poetry, religion, and so on. His works have greatly influenced contemporary thought and popular culture. He wrote on the topic of semen, "The resorption of semen by the blood is the strongest nourishment, and perhaps more than any other factor, it prompts the stimulus of power, the unrest of all forces, toward the overcoming of resistances, the thirst for contradiction and resistance. The feeling of power has so far mounted highest in abstinent priests and hermits, for example, among the Brahmins." Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was an American essayist, author, and philosopher from the 19th century. He is regarded as one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century. On the topic of sexual restraint and chastity, he wrote, "The generative energy, sexual energy, which, when we are loose, dissipates and makes us unclean, when we are continent, invigorates and inspires us. Chastity is the flowering of man, and what are called genius, heroism, holiness, and the like are but various fruits which succeed it." Bernard McFadden. The well-renowned healthy living advocate and father of the physical culture movement, wrote about the ills of masturbation in his books. He wrote the following: "Masturbation, also commonly known as self-abuse, is the greatest of all sexual evils, not only because of its widespread practice and the opportunity for excesses, but especially because of the fact that it generally works its harm during the period of growth, when the results of any sexual mistake or abuse are far more serious than they would be in adult life. The habit is injurious at any time of life, however, owing to the drain upon the constitution and the weakening or exhaustion of the nerve centers which it involves. It is truly an outrage upon the body to such an extent that the effects are not only physical, but moral or psychic as well. The mind and soul of the victim seem to be tainted at the same time that the body is weakened and sexual power impaired by this degrading practice. Masturbation is often thought to be more harmful to boys than to girls, because of the direct drain upon the resources of the body, in the case of the male, through the loss of the seminal fluid. But when one considers the havoc wrought upon the more delicate nervous systems of young women, it is not always so certain that they suffer less seriously from the practice than do young men. Naturally, the injury that results from this particular evil is influenced to a large extent by two factors. First, the general vital vigor of the victim, and second, by the effects on the whole physical fabric. For instance, if one is what might be termed high-strung, possesses a delicately adjusted and keenly sensitive nervous system, the effects of a habit of this sort would be far greater than in those who might be described as phlegmatic in temperament. The phlegmatic temperament is usually protected by superior vitality, but also by less inclination to indulge in a habit of this sort. Therefore, it might be said that the more ability one possesses, the more alert and keen one's mental capacity, the greater would be the inclination towards a habit of this sort, and the greater would be the harm wrought by its indulgence.